They were told American pilots were cruel, ruthless men who bombed cities without mercy. But when 250 German women prisoners stepped off transport trucks at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, in July 1945, what broke their carefully built walls of hatred was not cruelty or violence. It was something far more dangerous. Clean uniforms, bright smiles, and faces that looked like they belonged on cinema screens, not battlefields. The women expected monsters. Instead, they found men who looked like Hollywood stars. If you enjoy true World War II stories that reveal the surprising human moments of history, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring you more of these hidden stories from the war. Now let me take you back to that sweltering Louisiana summer, where everything these women believed about their enemy was about to crumble. The Louisiana heat hit them like a physical force. It was nothing like the damp cold of German winters or even the mild summers they remembered from before the war. This was thick, suffocating heat that made their threadbare Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms stick to their skin. The convoy of green military trucks rolled through Camp Ruston's main gate, wheels crunching over gravel, engines rumbling in the thick afternoon air. Through the canvas flaps of the trucks, the women caught their first glimpses of their new prison. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across flat, cleared land. Guard towers stood at intervals, but they seemed almost casual, not the menacing structures of concentration camps they had heard about in whispered rumors. American flags hung limp in the windless heat, and everywhere men in uniform moved with an easy confidence that seemed alien to these women who had spent months retreating through a collapsing Germany. The women themselves were a sorry sight. Greta, a 23-year-old radio operator from Hamburg, sat near the back of the lead truck. Her uniform, once a source of pride, was now torn at the hem and stained with travel dust. Her blonde hair, which she had once carefully pinned each morning, hung in limp strands around her hollow face. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She had not slept properly in weeks. Around her, the other women wore similar expressions of exhaustion mixed with fear. Some clutched small bags containing their few remaining possessions. Others held nothing at all, having lost everything in the chaos of Germany's final collapse. The truck lurched to a stop, and the first thing that hit Greta was the smell. Not the expected stench of filth and despair she had been warned about, but something completely unexpected. Food. Real food. The rich aroma of frying meat drifted across the compound from somewhere nearby. Her stomach clenched painfully. She could not remember the last time she had smelled meat cooking. In Germany, during those final months, they had survived on turnip soup and bread that was more sawdust than flour. Then came the sounds. Not screaming or gunfire, but something stranger. American voices calling to each other in relaxed tones. Laughter, actual laughter, floating across the camp. The crack of a baseball bat connecting with a ball somewhere in the distance. A radio playing music, not the harsh propaganda marches she knew, but smooth, jazzy melodies she had never heard before. It was all so normal, so casual, as if there was not a war, as if these were not prisoners arriving to face punishment. The tailgate of the truck dropped with a metallic clang, flooding the dark interior with blinding Louisiana sunlight. Greta squinted against the glare, her eyes struggling to adjust. Through the brightness, she could make out shapes. American soldiers, dozens of them, standing in loose formation. Waiting. She braced herself for shouting, for rough hands, for the brutality she had been promised would come. A hand appeared at the edge of the tailgate. Young, clean, with neatly trimmed fingernails. It was offered to help her down. Greta stared at it, frozen. This simple gesture of assistance shattered her expectations so completely that for a moment she could not move. An American voice, patient and even gentle, said something in English she did not understand. The tone was not harsh. It was almost kind. Greta's hand trembled as she finally took the offered help. Her boots hit the ground and she looked up into the face of her enemy. He was young, maybe 25, with a clean-shaven jaw and clear blue eyes. He smiled at her, a brief professional smile, then moved to help the next woman. Greta stood frozen, trying to process what she was seeing. All around her, the other women were having similar moments of confusion. They stumbled from the trucks, looking around with wide eyes and tight faces. Some whispered to each other in rapid German, others simply stood in silence, their minds struggling to match the reality before them with the images of American cruelty they had been fed for years. These were not the savage monsters from propaganda posters. These were clean, well-fed young men who moved with casual efficiency and spoke in measured tones. Frida, a nurse from Berlin who stood next to Greta, breathed out words that barely qualified as a whisper. She said in German, repeating it as if testing the reality of it. Her chest felt tight. Every step toward the processing building felt like walking deeper into a dream that made no sense. But the strangeness had only begun. Wait, they were told. The fear lingered with every step, but something else crept in alongside it. Something they had not felt in years. Curiosity. They were marched into a long wooden building. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and the women's eyes took a moment to adjust. Medical equipment lined one wall, tables with clipboards and forms, and sinks. So many sinks. Greta's heart began to race. This was it, she thought. This was where the degradation would begin. She had heard stories, terrible stories, of what happened to women prisoners during processing. The women were divided into groups of 10. An American officer, a woman in a crisp military uniform, stood before them. She spoke in German, heavily accented but understandable. She explained the procedures calmly and clearly. Medical examinations, delousing, clean uniforms. Personal items would be cataloged and stored safely. Letters could be written home once they were settled. Greta expected cruelty in her tone, some hint of satisfaction at their capture. Instead, the American woman's voice was matter-of-fact, almost bored, as if she had given this speech 100 times before. Because Greta realized with a start she probably had. They were not special. They were just one more group of prisoners in a war that had processed millions. The medical examination came first. American doctors and nurses, both men and women, moved efficiently through their work. They checked eyes, ears, throats. They looked for signs of disease, malnutrition, injury. Their touches were clinical but not cruel. When Greta flinched at a touch to her shoulder, the American nurse paused, spoke something soft in English, and waited for Greta to relax before continuing. The gentleness was almost harder to bear than roughness would have been. Then came the moment Greta had been dreading most. The showers. The women were led into a large tiled room. Steam already filled the air, warm and thick. They were given towels, thick white towels that looked brand new, and bars of soap. Actual soap. Not the gray, gritty substitute they had used in Germany, but white, clean-smelling bars that felt smooth in the hand. Greta held the soap like it might disappear. She brought it to her nose and inhaled. It smelled like flowers, like something from a world she had almost forgotten existed. Around her, other women were having the same stunned reactions. Some began to cry silently. Others laughed in disbelief. The contradiction of it all, the gap between expectation and reality, was almost too much to process. The water, when it came, was hot. Actually hot. Greta stood under the stream and felt months of dirt, sweat, and despair wash away. She scrubbed her skin until it turned pink. She washed her hair 3 times, working the soap through the tangles until it felt clean again. The other women did the same, and gradually the sound of crying and laughing mixed with the rush of water. It was absurd. It was wonderful. It was completely unexpected. When they emerged, dressed in clean work clothes that smelled of soap and sun, Greta caught sight of herself in a polished, metal mirror. For the first time in months, she looked almost human again. Her face was still thin, still marked by dark circles, but she was clean. Her hair, though still damp, was no longer matted. She touched her cheek, surprised by how smooth her own skin felt. Frida stood beside her, staring at her own reflection. She said the words quietly, but they carried weight. This was not how captivity was supposed to begin. They were led to the mess hall as the sun began to set, painting the Louisiana sky in shades of orange and red. The building was larger than any dining facility Greta had seen in the Wehrmacht. Long tables stretched in neat rows, and the smell that had teased them from the trucks now hit with full force. Meat, bread, coffee, vegetables. The rich, overwhelming scent of abundance. The women formed a line, each given a metal tray. American soldiers, men who looked too young to have seen battle, served food from behind a counter. They wore clean aprons and moved with the practiced ease of people who did this every day. One by one the women shuffled forward, their eyes growing wider with each step. When Greta reached the counter, a young American soldier, his hair dark and neatly combed, looked up at her with a friendly expression. He said something in English, his tone light, almost cheerful. When she did not respond, he simply smiled and began loading her tray. A thick slice of meatloaf, glistening with gravy. A mound of mashed potatoes, real potatoes, not the black, half-rotten ones that had been all Germany could spare toward the end. Green beans, more than she had seen in a single meal in 2 years. 2 slices of white bread, soft and fresh, and butter. Actual butter, yellow and rich, sitting in a small pat on the edge of her tray. Greta's hand shook as she took the tray. She looked down at the food and felt tears prick her eyes. This single meal contained more calories, more nutrition than she had eaten in a week back in Germany. Behind her, she heard Frida make a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. They found seats at one of the long tables. For a long moment, none of the women moved. They just stared at their trays, unable to process what they were seeing. Then slowly, someone picked up a fork. Others followed. Greta cut into the meatloaf, watching the gravy run across the plate. She brought a small piece to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue. Rich, savory, real. Her eyes closed involuntarily. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly as if afraid the food might vanish. Several cried openly, their shoulders shaking as they chewed. Frida put down her fork after only a few bites. She whispered the words in German, her voice thick with emotion. Greta knew what she meant. In Germany, people were starving. Children were dying of hunger in the streets. Their own families were surviving on scraps. And here in captivity, in the hands of their enemies, they were being fed like this. An older woman across the table, her gray hair still damp from the showers, spoke up. She had been a typist in Munich. She stared at her tray, her lined face twisted with confusion and something that might have been shame. The contradiction cut deeper than any blade. They ate in near silence. The only sounds the clink of forks on metal trays and the occasional muffled sob. Across the mess hall, American soldiers ate at their own tables, talking and laughing. They barely seemed to notice the German women. To them, this was just another meal, just another day. The normalcy of it, the casualness, was perhaps the most shocking thing of all. When Greta finished, her stomach felt uncomfortably full. She could not remember the last time she had felt full, truly full. She placed her hands on her stomach and tried to process the sensation. It felt wrong somehow. Wrong to be satisfied when her mother, her sisters, everyone she loved back home was probably going to bed hungry that night. As darkness fell over Camp Rustin, the women were led to their barracks. The building was long and wooden with screens on the windows and electric lights hanging from the ceiling. Inside, rows of metal frame beds lined the walls. Each bed had a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 wool blankets folded neatly at the foot. Greta chose a bed near one of the windows. She sat on the edge of the mattress and felt it give slightly under her weight. It was not soft, not luxurious, but it was clean and dry. She ran her hand over the blanket, feeling the rough wool under her palm. In Germany, toward the end, they had slept on whatever they could find. Coats, newspaper, sometimes just huddled together for warmth. A small wooden crate sat beside each bed for personal belongings. They had almost nothing to put in them, but the gesture was noted. They were being treated as if they had possessions, as if they had dignity. It was such a small thing, but after months of being herded like cattle through the chaos of Germany's collapse, it felt significant. The American officer who had supervised their processing appeared in the doorway. She explained in her careful German that lights would go out at 10 o'clock. Breakfast would be served at 6 in the morning. They were expected to keep their area clean. They would be assigned work details starting tomorrow. There were rules, of course, but they were stated calmly without threat. The officer then added something unexpected. They would be allowed to write letters home, through the Red Cross. The letters would be censored, but they could write. After the officer left, the women sat on their beds in stunned silence. Finally, someone spoke. It was the older woman from Munich, her voice barely above a whisper. She said it simply, but the words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Greta lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The light bulbs cast a yellow glow across the room. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp at night. American voices, distant music, the hum of generators. It was all so strange, so far from what she had imagined captivity would be. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, feeling the weight of it, the warmth. For the first time in months, she felt safe, and that feeling terrified her more than any threat could have. As the lights went out and darkness filled the barracks, Greta heard whispers moving through the room. Women talking quietly to each other, sharing their confusion, their relief, their guilt. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind would not rest. One thought kept circling back, persistent and troubling. If the enemy could show such unexpected humanity, what did that say about everything they had been taught? What did it say about the war itself? Morning came with a bell that rang across the camp at precisely 6 o'clock. Greta woke to sunlight streaming through the screened windows and the sound of American voices outside. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory returned, and with it the strange contradiction of her situation. The routine established itself quickly. Wake at 6, wash at the communal sinks, where hot water ran from taps that never seemed to empty. Breakfast at 6:30 in the mess hall. Eggs, sometimes bacon, always bread and coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they had drunk in Germany. Then work assignments, distributed by the American officers with the same efficient calm they applied to everything. Greta was assigned to the camp laundry. She spent her days washing and pressing American uniforms, the fabric heavy and well-made under her hands. The work was monotonous but not difficult. She worked alongside other German women, and they talked quietly as they worked, sharing stories of home, of family, of the strange new world they found themselves in. Frida was sent to the camp hospital, where her nursing skills were put to use. Others worked in the kitchens, in the gardens, cleaning barracks, or doing administrative tasks. The work was light compared to what they had done during the war, and most surprisingly, they were paid for it. Small amounts of camp script, paper currency that could only be used within the camp, but payment nonetheless. With this money, they could buy items at the camp canteen. Greta's first visit to the canteen left her speechless. The shelves were stocked with goods she had not seen in years. Chocolate bars, wrapped in bright paper, cigarettes in neat packs, soap, toothpaste, combs, small luxuries that had disappeared from Germany long before the war's end. She bought a chocolate bar with her first week's wages and ate it slowly, letting each square melt on her tongue, savoring the sweetness until it became almost painful. Meals continued to be the most jarring part of each day. 3 times a day, the women filed into the mess hall and were served food that would have been considered a feast in wartime Germany. The portions never decreased. The quality never dropped. Meat, vegetables, bread, milk, coffee, day after day, without fail. Greta found herself gaining weight, her face filling out, her body recovering from months of near starvation. It should have felt good. Instead, it felt like a betrayal. The letters from home began arriving in the third week. They came through the Red Cross, opened and read by censors, but still carrying news from Germany. Greta received her first letter from her mother on a Tuesday morning. Her hand shook as she opened it, recognizing her mother's careful handwriting on the envelope. The words were carefully chosen, knowing the censors would read them. But the message was clear. Hamburg was in ruins. Their apartment building had been destroyed in the final bombing raids. They were living with relatives in the countryside, 3 families crowded into a small farmhouse. Food was scarce. Her younger sister was sick, but there was no medicine. They were surviving, her mother wrote, but barely. Greta folded the letter with hands that would not stay steady. That evening at dinner she stared at her tray of food and could not bring herself to eat. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Letters had arrived for many of them, all carrying the same basic message. Germany was devastated. People were starving. The contrast between their suffering families and their own relative comfort was unbearable. The American abundance became harder to ignore. On work details outside the main camp, the women caught glimpses of the world beyond the fence. They saw Americans going about their daily lives. Cars on the roads, shiny and new. Houses with glass windows intact. Children playing in yards, healthy and well-fed. Shops with goods displayed in windows. It was like looking at another planet. One afternoon, while working in the camp gardens, Greta overheard 2 American guards talking. They were complaining about the food in the mess hall, saying the meatloaf was dry, the coffee weak. Greta stopped working, her hands frozen around the handle of her hoe. These men were complaining about food that would have been a feast in Germany. The disconnect was so vast, so complete, that for a moment she felt dizzy. The women noticed they were changing physically. Their faces filled out. Their hair regained its shine. The dull, lifeless look in their eyes gradually faded. They began to look less like refugees and more like the young women they had been before the war. But this physical recovery came with a heavy price. Every pound they gained felt like it was taken from their starving families. Every moment of comfort was shadowed by guilt. Frida said it best one evening as they sat on the steps of their barracks, watching the sunset. She said the words quietly, but with deep feeling. The irony was almost cruel. They had lost the war, lost their country, lost everything. And yet here they were, better fed and housed than they had been in years. Meanwhile, the victors they had fought for, bled for, were starving in the ruins. But it was the small human interactions that truly began to break down the walls. Not the big gestures, but the tiny, unexpected moments of connection that crept past their defenses. There was the guard who brought Greta a cup of coffee one morning when she was shivering in the cool dawn air. He did not say anything, just handed her the cup with a brief nod and walked away. The coffee was hot and sweet, and Greta wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. It was such a small thing, but it stayed with her all day. There was the American officer who noticed one of the women limping and arranged for her to see a doctor. The way he did it was so casual, so matter-of-fact, as if of course they would provide medical care to prisoners. The woman's foot was treated, bandaged, and she was given lighter duties until it healed. She cried when she told the others about it, not from pain, but from the strange gentleness of it all. Language became a bridge. Some of the American guards tried to learn German phrases. Some of the women tried to learn English. The attempts were clumsy, often comical, but they created moments of shared laughter. Greta found herself teaching a young guard how to say good morning in German. He repeated it carefully, his accent terrible, and they both laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in months. Cigarettes became an unexpected currency of connection. The Americans had them in abundance. Some guards would share them with the women during breaks, passing packs through the fence, or leaving them on tables. The act of sharing a cigarette, standing together in silence, became a strange ritual of humanity. They were still enemies, technically, but in those moments they were just people. Taking a break from work, sharing a smoke. Music became another point of connection. The Americans played their strange, energetic music on radios throughout the camp. Jazz, big band, songs the German women had never heard. At first they found it chaotic, almost offensive, but gradually some began to tap their feet to the rhythms. They began to recognize songs. One evening an American soldier taught a group of women how to dance the jitterbug. The scene was absurd. Enemy soldiers and enemy prisoners, dancing together in a prison camp while war still raged in the Pacific. But it happened, and it meant something. But nothing prepared them for the pilots. Camp Ruston was not just a facility for German prisoners. It was also a training ground for American pilots being prepared for deployment to the Pacific. The pilots were housed in separate quarters, but they shared some facilities with the camp, and they were impossible to ignore. Greta first saw them on a hot August morning. She was hanging laundry on the lines outside the washing facility when a group of young men in flight suits walked past. They were talking and laughing, their voices carrying across the compound. She glanced up and her hands froze on the wet sheet she was hanging. They looked like film stars. That was the only comparison her mind could make. They were tall, clean, impeccably groomed. Their hair was cut in the neat, slicked-back style popular in American movies. Their flight suits fit perfectly, and underneath she could see clean white t-shirts. But it was their faces that struck her most. They were handsome in that easy, confident American way she had only seen in propaganda films meant to mock American vanity. Square jaws, bright smiles, clear skin untouched by the grime and exhaustion of war. One of them noticed her staring and smiled. It was not a cruel smile or a mocking one. It was friendly, open, the kind of smile that seemed to come naturally to Americans. He even tipped his head slightly in greeting before continuing on with his companions. Greta stood frozen, a wet sheet hanging forgotten in her hands. That evening the barracks buzzed with conversation about the pilots. Frida, who had seen them near the hospital, said breathlessly. She was not alone. Other women echoed the sentiment. They could not help it. These men, these enemy pilots who had probably dropped bombs on German cities, looked like they had stepped out of a Hollywood movie. It became harder to maintain hatred when the enemy looked like that. The propaganda had shown Americans as crude, ugly, violent. These men were none of those things. They were young, healthy, confident. They moved with an easy grace that came from never knowing real hunger, real fear, real deprivation. They were everything the propaganda had claimed Americans were not. Over the following weeks, interactions with the pilots became more frequent. They trained on the airfield adjacent to the camp, and the women could hear their planes taking off and landing. Sometimes during breaks, the pilots would walk past the work areas where the women were assigned. They were always polite. Some would nod in greeting, others would say hello in their confident American voices. A few even tried German phrases, their attempts endearing in their awkwardness. One pilot in particular caught everyone's attention. His name, they learned, was Lieutenant James Morrison. He had dark hair, green eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. He seemed to go out of his way to be kind to the German women. He learned several German phrases and used them whenever he passed. He brought small gifts sometimes. A spare chocolate bar, a magazine, once a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked, which he presented to the older Munich woman with a theatrical bow that made everyone laugh despite themselves. Greta found herself looking for him and hated herself for it. He was the enemy. He was a pilot, possibly one who had bombed German cities, killed German civilians. She should hate him. But when he smiled at her, when he said good morning in his terrible German, she found herself smiling back. The confusion was maddening. The women talked about the pilots constantly now. It became an obsession of sorts. They compared notes on who had seen whom. They debated which pilot was the most handsome. They wondered about their lives, their families, their futures. It was inappropriate, perhaps even shameful, to be so focused on their captors in this way. But they could not help it. After years of war, of fear, of propaganda, these men represented something unexpected. They represented a world that was still normal, still beautiful, still hopeful. One evening, Lieutenant Morrison stopped by the laundry facility where Greta was working late. He needed to pick up his uniforms, which had been cleaned earlier that day. Greta retrieved them, her hands shaking slightly as she handed them over. He thanked her in English, then added in careful German that her work was very good. For a moment, they just looked at each other. He was so close she could see the individual lashes around his green eyes. He smelled clean, like soap and something else, something light and masculine that she could not identify. Cologne, perhaps. A luxury she had forgotten existed. Then he smiled that easy American smile and said something else in English she did not understand. But his tone was kind, his expression warm. He nodded, took his uniforms, and left. Greta stood alone in the laundry room, her heart pounding. She felt her face flush, and it had nothing to do with the heat from the washing machines. That night she lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what she was feeling. She was a prisoner. He was her captor. They were enemies. And yet when he looked at her, she did not feel like an enemy. She felt like a woman being noticed by an attractive man. The realization shamed her and thrilled her in equal measure. The contradiction gnawed at Greta more deeply with each passing day. Every interaction with the Americans, every kindness, every moment of unexpected humanity forced her to confront the beliefs she had held for years. The propaganda had been so clear, so certain. Americans were the enemy. They were cruel, violent, uncivilized. The Reich was protecting Germany from these monsters. But the reality before her eyes told a completely different story. The Americans fed her, clothed her, treated her with basic dignity. They worked within rules, followed procedures, showed restraint. Meanwhile, her own nation, the one she had served, had left its people to starve in ruins. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Greta began to question everything. Late at night, when the barracks were dark and quiet, she would lie awake and replay moments from her past. The speeches she had heard about German superiority, the promises of victory, the certainty that their cause was just. How much of it had been lies? How much had been truth twisted beyond recognition? She thought about her work during the war. She had been a radio operator, relaying messages, coordinating movements. She had believed she was helping to defend her homeland. But what had she really been doing? Supporting a war machine that had brought nothing but destruction. Supporting a regime that had led Germany to ruin. The guilt was crushing. And yet survival demanded a certain level of acceptance. They were prisoners, yes, but they were alive. They were fed. They were safe. To continue clinging to hatred seemed pointless, even dangerous. But to let go of that hatred, to admit that the enemy might actually be decent people, felt like betraying everything she had once believed in. The internal conflict tore at her constantly. The barracks at night became a place of whispered debates. The women grappled with their situation collectively, trying to make sense of it together. Not everyone processed it the same way. Some, particularly the younger women, adapted quickly. They learned English phrases eagerly. They laughed at American jokes they did not fully understand. They openly admired the pilots and talked about them like schoolgirls discussing movie stars. To them, the war was over. Germany had lost. There was no point in maintaining hatred toward people who were treating them decently. Others, especially the older women and those who had lost family members to Allied bombing, held on to their resentment. They ate the American food because they had no choice, but they did so silently, refusing to show gratitude. They kept to themselves, speaking only German, maintaining a wall of hostility even as they accepted American generosity. To them, accepting kindness felt like collaboration. One evening, a heated argument broke out. A young woman from Dresden had been laughing with an American guard earlier that day, and one of the older women confronted her about it. She said harshly, her voice cutting through the barracks. The young woman shot back, her eyes flashing. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Frida intervened before it could escalate further. She spoke quietly but firmly. Her words settled over the room like a blanket. Because she was right. None of them knew how to process this. They were caught between their past loyalties and their present reality, and the gap between the two seemed impossible to bridge. Greta found herself somewhere in the middle. She could not fully embrace the Americans as the younger women did, but neither could she maintain the rigid hatred of the older generation. She existed in a state of constant internal negotiation, weighing every interaction, questioning every feeling. It was exhausting, but it was honest. Slowly, painfully, a deeper understanding began to emerge. It came not in a single moment of revelation, but in accumulated observations and experiences that built upon each other until they could no longer be ignored. The Americans, Greta realized, were displaying their power in the most devastating way possible. Not through cruelty or domination, but through abundance and order. Every meal served was a demonstration that America had not been touched by war. Every clean uniform was proof of an intact industrial base. Every casual kindness showed a society secure enough to afford mercy. They did not need to be cruel because they had already won. The war had barely scratched them while Germany lay in ashes. This realization was more humiliating than any insult could have been. The Reich had promised Germany would rule the world. Instead, they had achieved only their own destruction. Meanwhile, the nation they had dismissed as weak and decadent had crushed them without even suffering significantly. The Americans could afford to be kind to their prisoners because being kind cost them nothing. But there was something else, something that went deeper than power dynamics. The Americans treated them as if they had value as individuals. Not as Germans, not as enemies, but as people. The doctors checked their health because healthy people mattered. The officers maintained order because human dignity required it. The guards showed small kindnesses because apparently that was just what decent people did. This concept of individual worth was foreign to women raised under the Reich. They had been taught that individuals mattered only insofar as they served the state. Personal needs, personal desires, personal dignity were all secondary to national duty. But the Americans seemed to operate under different rules. They had systems, procedures, rights that applied to everyone, even prisoners, even enemies. One afternoon, Greta witnessed something that crystallized this understanding. A German woman had been caught stealing food from the kitchen. It was not much, just a few rolls she had hidden to send back to her family somehow. She was brought before an American officer to face discipline. Greta expected harsh punishment. Under the Reich, theft was dealt with severely, but the American officer simply asked the woman why she had taken the food. When she explained through tears that she wanted to send it to her starving children, the officer nodded slowly. He explained that they could not allow theft, but he understood her motivation. Her punishment was light, just extra duties for a week, and then unexpectedly he arranged for her to receive additional rations through official channels to send home through the Red Cross. The woman wept with gratitude, and Greta understood something fundamental. The American system was not built on fear and absolute obedience. It was built on rules, yes, but rules that acknowledged human nature, human need, human weakness. It was not soft exactly, but it was something the Reich had never been. It was humane. Perhaps Greta thought late one night this was the real reason Germany had lost. Not because of military inferiority, though that had played a role, but because they had built their nation on hatred and fear. while the Americans had built theirs on something else, something that, even now, she did not fully understand but could no longer deny seeing. The moment of complete ideological break came on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in late September. The Louisiana heat had finally broken and the air carried a hint of autumn coolness. Greta was working in the laundry as usual, her hands moving through the familiar motions of washing and pressing American uniforms. Lieutenant Morrison came in to pick up his uniforms. By now these encounters had become routine. They would exchange greetings in a mix of German and English. He would thank her for her work. Sometimes they would share a brief conversation, limited by language but warm in tone. Today seemed no different. But as Greta handed him his pressed uniforms, he paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He showed it to her with a shy smile. It was a family photo. A woman, pretty and smiling, stood beside him. Two small children, a boy and a girl, grinned at the camera. His wife and kids, he explained in simple English, speaking slowly so she might understand. Greta stared at the photo and something inside her broke. This man, this pilot who looked like a Hollywood star, was not a monster. He was a husband, a father. He probably missed his family terribly. He was fighting in a war, just like the German men she had known, just like her own brothers. He was human, completely, undeniably human. Tears began to stream down her face before she could stop them. Morrison looked alarmed, clearly worried he had upset her somehow. He started to apologize in his halting German, but Greta shook her head. She managed to say one word in English, a word she had learned, and she gestured to the photo, trying to convey that he had a beautiful family. He understood. His expression softened with relief and something that might have been compassion. He said something else in English, his tone gentle. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and briefly, very briefly, touched her shoulder. It was the lightest of touches, barely a second, but it carried weight. It was a gesture of shared humanity, of recognition. Then he took his uniforms and left. Greta stood alone in the laundry room, shaking. Everything she had believed, everything she had been taught, came crashing down around her. The enemy was not evil. The enemy was just people. People with families, with hopes, with kindness in their hearts. And if the enemy was human, then what did that make the war? What did that make everything Germany had done? That night she sat on her bunk and stared at her hands. These hands had served the Reich. These hands had worked for a war machine that had brought destruction across Europe. She had believed she was doing right, defending her homeland. But what if she had been wrong all along? What if the real evil had been on her side? The pain of this realization was physical. It felt like something vital had been torn out of her chest. She had lost the war, lost her country, lost her home, but now she was losing something even more fundamental. She was losing the certainty that had guided her entire adult life. She was losing the story she had told herself about who she was and what she fought for. Frida found her later, sitting in the dark, tears running silently down her face. She sat beside Greta without saying anything for a long time. Finally, Greta spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Frida did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was heavy with her own pain. They sat together in the darkness, two women facing the collapse of everything they had once believed. As autumn turned to winter, rumors of repatriation began to circulate. Germany needed to be rebuilt. Prisoners would be sent home. The women should have been jubilant. They were going home. But instead, the announcement was met with a strange, uncomfortable silence. Greta lay awake at night, thinking about what waited for her in Germany. Her mother's letters painted a bleak picture. Hamburg was gone, reduced to rubble. Jobs were non-existent. Food was scarce. The black market thrived while regular people starved. Occupation forces controlled everything. The proud nation she had left was now a defeated, broken territory divided among the victors. And what would she tell her family about her captivity? That she had been fed 3 meals a day? That she had gained weight? That the Americans had treated her with basic human decency? How could she explain that without sounding like she had somehow enjoyed being a prisoner while they suffered? The fear of leaving was shameful to acknowledge, but it was real. In the camp, they were safe. They had routine, food, shelter. They knew what each day would bring. Germany was chaos, uncertainty, hardship. Several women admitted quietly that they were afraid to go back. Some even whispered that they wished they could stay in America, though they knew such a thing was impossible. The American officers noticed the subdued mood. One of them, speaking through an interpreter, told the women that they understood this was difficult. He reminded them that they were survivors, that they were strong, that they would rebuild. The words were meant to encourage, but they rang hollow. How do you rebuild when everything you believed in has proven false? The day of departure came in early December. The women were processed out with the same efficiency they had been processed in. Their few belongings were returned. They were given new clothes, better than the rags they had arrived in. They were provided with basic supplies for the journey. The Americans, methodical to the end, made sure they had what they needed. Lieutenant Morrison came to say goodbye. He found Greta near the trucks that would take them to the port. He shook her hand formally, but his green eyes were warm. He wished her well in careful German. He hoped she would find her family safe. He said he was glad their two nations were no longer enemies. Greta tried to speak, but found her throat too tight. She managed to thank him in English, the word coming out rough but sincere. He smiled that Hollywood smile one last time, then stepped back. She climbed into the truck with the other women, and they rolled out through the gates of Camp Ruston for the last time. The journey back across the Atlantic was cold and rough. The women huddled together in the ship's hold, wrapped in blankets, wondering what they would find on the other side. The war in Europe had been over for months, but they had been insulated from the full reality of Germany's defeat. Now they were going back to face it. When they finally saw the German coast, Greta's heart sank. Even from a distance, the devastation was visible. Cities that had once been proud and beautiful were now skeletal ruins. The ship docked in Bremerhaven, itself badly damaged, and the women disembarked into a cold December drizzle. The contrast hit Greta like a physical blow. She had grown accustomed to American abundance, American order, American normalcy. Now she was back in a world of ruins, chaos, and desperate survival. People on the docks looked thin, worn, defeated. American and British occupation soldiers were everywhere, a constant reminder of who had won the war. Greta made her way to Hamburg, or what was left of it. The train ride showed her a landscape of destruction. Cities bombed into rubble, bridges destroyed, factories gutted. The Germany she had known was gone, replaced by a nightmare of devastation. When she finally reached the address her mother had given in letters, she found her family living in 2 rooms of a partially destroyed building. They had survived, but barely. Her mother hugged her tight, crying with relief. Her younger sister stared at her with wide eyes. Both looked so thin, so worn. And Greta, healthy and relatively strong from months of American food, felt the crushing weight of guilt. She could not tell them about the meals, the clean beds, the kindness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The gap between her experience and theirs was too vast. Greta spent the next years helping to rebuild, like millions of other Germans. She worked whatever jobs she could find. She stood in bread lines. She dealt with occupation bureaucracy. She, like everyone else, tried to survive in a defeated nation learning to live under new rules. But she never forgot those months in Camp Ruston. They stayed with her, a strange interlude that did not fit with the rest of her war story. She never forgot the taste of that first real meal. She never forgot the feeling of clean clothes, hot water, basic dignity. And she never forgot Lieutenant Morrison and his family photo, the moment that had broken through all her certainties. Years later, when she had children of her own, they would sometimes ask about the war. Greta would tell them some stories, carefully edited. But when they asked about her time as a prisoner, she would pause. How could she explain? How could she make them understand that the enemy had shown her more humanity than her own side ever had? Eventually, she found the words. She told her daughter once when the girl was old enough to understand complex truths, that sometimes the hardest thing to carry is not hatred, but the memory of unexpected kindness. Hatred is simple, she explained. It asks nothing of you except to hold on to it. But kindness, real kindness from someone you were taught to hate, that demands something harder. It demands that you question everything you believed, and that can be more painful than any cruelty. Frida, who had stayed in touch over the years, put it differently when they met for coffee in the 1960s. They were both middle-aged women now, with families and lives far removed from that strange summer in Louisiana. Frida stirred her coffee slowly and said the words thoughtfully. Greta nodded, understanding completely. The experience had changed them all, every woman who had passed through that camp. It had forced them to see their enemies as human beings. It had shattered the propaganda they had been fed. It had shown them that the world was more complex, more nuanced than they had been allowed to believe. And that knowledge, painful as it was, had shaped who they became in the years that followed. And so the soap, the clean uniforms, the hot meals, and yes, even those Hollywood handsome pilots became more than just memories of captivity. They became proof of something deeper. They became evidence that even in war, humanity can persist, that enemies can show mercy, that assumptions can be shattered, that people, when given the chance, can be decent to one another even across the deepest divides. For those German women, the taste of American coffee, the smell of real soap, and the image of Lieutenant Morrison's family photo became symbols they carried forever. Not symbols of defeat, but symbols of the painful truth that their own nation had abandoned them while their enemies restored their dignity. Sometimes mercy cuts deeper than hatred. Sometimes kindness is the most devastating weapon of all. As Greta told her daughter years later, in words she had spent decades finding, the hardest thing about that time was not being captured, not being imprisoned, not even being defeated. The hardest thing was learning that everything we had been taught about our enemies was a lie. And once you learn that one lie, you begin to question all the others. That is what real surrender looks like. Not raising a white flag, but raising questions about everything you once held certain. And that is the story worth remembering. Not just a tale of prisoners and captors, but a reminder that propaganda crumbles in the face of human decency, that hatred cannot survive real encounter with the humanity of the enemy, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not violence, but simple, unexpected kindness. If you found this story meaningful, if it made you think about the complexity of war and the resilience of human decency even in the darkest times, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you these hidden stories from World War II because they remind us of truths that remain relevant today. The past speaks to us if we listen carefully enough. Thank you for listening to this story. Until next time, remember that history is not just about battles and dates. It is about people, about choices, about the moments that change us forever.